Wrong door, sir? Must be nice to wander into any room and assume it's yours. The mocking lilt in her voice stopped him colder than the sea air outside. Ethan Sinclair had built an empire on confidence, on the belief that every space bent to his presence, every face turned when he entered. But here, inside a cabin that wasn't his, stood a woman who didn't look up in awe, didn't rush to please, didn't even flinch. Barefoot, with a sketchpad balanced on her lap, she saw through the polish, through the linen blazer and silvered hair, and met him not as billionaire, but as a man caught where he didn't belong. One wrong cabin, one wrong step, and suddenly the man who had everything was face to face with someone who refused to be impressed. Stay with us, because what starts as a slip of the key becomes a story that unlocks far more than a door. The Aurora Odyssey cut through the Caribbean waters like a jeweled blade, its decks awash in champagne laughter and the flash of diamonds catching the setting sun. Ethan Sinclair adjusted the cuff of his linen blazer as he slipped out of the crowded cocktail lounge, leaving behind the familiar cacophony of polished flattery and hollow laughter. At 42, with salt beginning to silver his temples and the weight of an empire pressing always at his back, Ethan carried himself with the precision of a man who knew the world bent for him, or at least believed it should. The corridor stretched long and quiet, a relief from the crush of networking and empty conversations about mergers, acquisitions, and yachts. His leather loafers whispered against the carpet as he moved, mind still humming with numbers and names, distracted by the glow of his phone. Without glancing at the brass plate, he slid the keycard into a door, exhaling with the expectation of solitude. But the moment he stepped inside, he froze. The cabin was not his. The air smelled faintly of sandalwood and salt, softer than the sharp citrus cologne he left behind in his own suite. A single suitcase sat neatly at the foot of the bed, worn leather patched at the corners, a traveler's bag rather than a businessman's trunk. And by the window, framed by the dusky horizon, sat a woman. She did not flinch at his sudden entrance. Her gaze lifted slowly, dark eyes catching the light like obsidian kissed with fire. Her skin, smooth and mahogany, glowed against the white linen dress that draped her frame with unstudied elegance. Bare feet curled beneath her, toes brushing the edge of a sketchpad balanced on her lap. She held a pencil in one hand, as if he were not an intruder, but a subject she might render on the page. Ethan's carefully measured world slipped for a beat. He stammered something, an apology, a misplaced explanation, but the words caught in his throat. The woman tilted her head, a small smile touching her lips, not cruel, but knowing. "Wrong door?" she asked, her voice low, touched with a warmth that unnerved him more than anger would have. He nodded, suddenly aware of how stiff he stood, of how out of place his pressed linen and polished shoes seemed in this quiet space that hummed with authenticity. For a man who thought he had seen every room, every deal, every face worth knowing, the revelation was as startling as it was inevitable. Ethan Sinclair had entered the wrong cabin, but standing before Maya Jefferson, he could not shake the feeling that perhaps it was the only right step he had taken in years. Maya Jefferson did not shift when Ethan lingered in the doorway, her pencil still resting lightly against the page. The late sun streamed through the glass, painting her silhouette in shades of gold and shadow, as if the sea itself had claimed her as its muse. She was 33, though there was a steadiness in her posture, a quiet command in the way she held herself that made her seem older and younger at once, older in wisdom, younger in spirit. Her braids, drawn back with a silk scarf patterned in indigo swirls, fell over one shoulder like a cascade of night. The linen dress she wore was plain, loose, but it carried the elegance of someone who did not need embellishment to be noticed. Ethan, who had spent his life surrounded by people desperate to be noticed, was struck by that. His apologies tripped over themselves, but she raised a hand slightly, not dismissive, but patient, as though she'd encountered far more disruptive things than a stranger walking through the wrong door. "You look like you've run from a room that was too loud," she said softly, the corner of her mouth curving as she returned her gaze to the sketch before her. He hesitated, surprised at the accuracy. "Networking event," he admitted, his voice carrying the edge of fatigue he usually concealed. She shaded a line on her page. "And yet, here you are, in the quiet." Her words, simple as they were, felt like they had been waiting for him. He took a step inside without quite meaning to, his eyes flicking to the sketchpad in her lap. What he saw disarmed him, a rendering of the ocean beyond, each wave etched with precision, the restless energy of the sea captured in charcoal strokes. It wasn't just accurate, it was alive. "You're an artist," he said, though it sounded inadequate. She shrugged lightly. "Trying to be. This cruise cost me more than I'll admit, but I wanted to see the sea this way, far from shore. To feel it, before I dared to paint it. Some things can't be borrowed, they have to be lived." Her voice carried no self-pity, only conviction. Ethan found himself at a loss, his well-practiced remarks about markets and milestones rendered useless. He could only stand there, feeling both intruder and student, as if he'd stepped not just into the wrong cabin, but into another kind of truth. Maya Jefferson didn't belong to the glittering world he came from. She belonged to something deeper. And for the first time in years, Ethan Sinclair felt the ground shift beneath him. Ethan lingered just inside the doorway, one hand brushing over the frame as though holding on to the last bit of certainty he carried with him. He repeated his apology, quieter this time, but his voice lacked the conviction of a man eager to leave. Something about her presence made retreat feel like the greater mistake. Maya glanced up, her expression unreadable but touched with a spark of humor that softened the edges. "Another lost suit," she said, her tone light but edged with knowing. The ship must be crawling with them tonight. The remark should have stung, but instead, Ethan found himself smiling in spite of his own discomfort. He stepped closer, his eyes drawn once again to the sketchpad in her lap. She shifted slightly, almost protective of the page, but not enough to hide it. The lines captured not just the waves, but the spirit beneath them, shadows of movement, whispers of power restrained by form. He had seen hundreds of renderings in glossy offices and high-rise lobbies, yet nothing that looked like this. "You draw the ocean like it's alive," he said softly. "It is," she replied, meeting his gaze. "Alive, restless, never the same twice. People look at it and see blue. I look at it and see moods." Ethan tilted his head, unsettled by the simplicity of her truth. In his world, water was bottled, branded, sold. Everything was measured, quantified, turned into value. Here, in her voice, it was untamable, sacred. For the first time in years, he felt the buzzing inside his head begin to still. He lowered himself carefully into the chair opposite hers, linen blazer folding at the elbows, tie loosened, though he hadn't noticed. "And what mood is it tonight?" he asked. She studied the horizon through the glass before answering. "It's daring. Testing those who write it, waiting to see who listens and who fights." Her words fell like a challenge, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he accepted it without argument. Silence followed, but it wasn't heavy. It was curious, charged, like the pause between waves. Ethan, a man who thrived on control and speed, felt himself slowing, listening, caught in a rhythm that belonged to neither boardroom nor ballroom. For a moment, he forgot about the wrong cabin, the wrong door, the mistake that had brought him here. Sitting across from Maya Jefferson, Ethan Sinclair realized that stillness, long denied, might be the rarest discovery of all. The night air wrapped the Aurora Odyssey in a hush that belonged only to the open sea. Midnight had draped the deck in silver, moonlight spilling across polished rails and the endless stretch of black water beyond. The chatter and music from the lounge were distant echoes now, carried off by the wind, leaving behind a quiet so complete it felt like stepping into another world. Ethan leaned against the railing, his tie loosened, the crisp lines of his blazer forgotten. For once, he wasn't a CEO, not a name in glossy magazines, just a man staring at a horizon that refused to end. A few feet away, Maya sat cross-legged on a deck chair, sketchpad balanced against her knees. She moved her pencil in quick, fluid strokes, capturing the silhouettes of late-night wanderers strolling arm in arm, the curve of a child chasing a balloon across the boards, the stoop of an old man who paused every few steps to look at the stars. She drew them not as individuals but as shadows set against the vastness of the ocean, each one small yet essential, like notes in a larger song. Ethan watched her more than the sea, drawn to the stillness she carried with her, the way she seemed to belong to the night. Finally, unable to hold the silence, he asked, "What are you sketching now?" She didn't look up. People who don't know they're being seen. It's when they're the truest. Her answer landed with a weight he didn't expect. He exhaled, the sound sharp against the quiet. "I wouldn't even know what that looks like anymore." That was when she set the pencil down, turned her gaze to him and asked, "Do you even know what silence sounds like?" The question startled him more than if she had asked about his fortune or his past. He searched for an answer, but the truth rose uninvited. "No," he admitted, his voice lower than he intended. "I don't." For the first time that evening, she laughed, not loudly, not unkindly, but with a softness that felt like a release. The sound folded into the night air, not mocking him, but freeing him from the need to answer further. Ethan, who had built his life on always having the last word, let the quiet stand. And in that silence, on a deck glowing under the pull of the moon, something delicate began to form between them, a fragile bond, as elusive as the tide, yet no less real. The following evening found them seated across from one another in the ship's smaller dining room, a place where the clink of silverware was gentler and the ocean's rhythm pressed closer against the windows. Maya wore a modest sundress patterned with faded florals, her braids tied loosely at her nape. Ethan had left his navy suit behind, appearing instead in a white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, a man shedding the armor of his usual world piece by piece. For once, there was no table full of shareholders or journalists, no stage for posturing, just a meal, 2 glasses of wine, and the weight of unspoken truths waiting to be set free. Maya broke the silence first. She told him of her mother, a woman whose hands bore the marks of endless hours scrubbing other people's floors, who came home late and tired, but never too tired, to leave her daughter a scrap of paper, a stub of pencil, something to sketch with. "Art supplies were luxuries," Maya said, tracing the rim of her glass. "Every line I drew as a child felt like I was stealing time from her exhaustion. I learned early to make every mark count." Her eyes glimmered in the low light, not with pity, but with fierce remembrance. Ethan listened, really listened, his fork forgotten. When she turned the question toward him, he felt the urge to offer the polished version, the kind he gave in magazine profiles. Instead, he surprised himself. He spoke of the nights hunched over code in a dim apartment, the taste of ramen, and the sting of failure when deals collapsed. He confessed that his empire wasn't built on vision alone, but on fear. Fear of returning to the obscurity he had once clawed his way out of. Fear of being measured and found wanting. Success, he admitted, voice quieter now, was supposed to feel like freedom. But mostly it feels like running. Her gaze didn't flinch. She let the silence settle, as if testing the weight of his words before saying, "Then maybe you've been chasing the wrong horizon." The remark lingered, simple yet devastating. Their differences were undeniable, her life stitched together with sacrifice, his defined by relentless ambition. But somewhere in the exchange, dignity braided their stories together. As the ship rocked gently beneath them, it felt as though the tide itself had drawn them closer, weaving two lives from opposite shores into the same current. The first raindrops came as a whisper against the glass, but soon the sky broke wide open. The Aurora Odyssey shuddered under the weight of waves that rose like dark mountains, spray lashing across the deck. The elegant dining rooms emptied quickly, passengers clutching at railings, voices low with unease. Lightning flared, bleaching the sea in sudden white, and the ship groaned as though the ocean meant to test its bones. Ethan and Maya had been walking the corridor when the worst of it struck, the lights flickering as the vessel pitched. Without thinking, he reached for her hand, steadying them both as they stumbled. By instinct, they ducked into her cabin, the door closing on the chaos outside. Inside, the room trembled with every strike of water against steel, the windows streaked with sheets of rain. For a moment, neither spoke. The storm was too loud, too present. Maya sat on the edge of the bed, her sketchpad abandoned on the table, her arms folded tightly across her chest. She was not afraid of the sea itself. That much was clear in the way she faced the window, eyes following the rhythm of the waves instead of shrinking from them. But something in her had shifted, and when she finally spoke, her voice was low, stripped of its usual steadiness. "It's not the ocean that scares me," she admitted. "It's men like you. Men who look at me and see less, who decide before I even open my mouth what I'm worth." Ethan felt the words strike harder than the thunder outside. He wanted to protest, to insist he wasn't like that, but the truth pressed in on him, undeniable. For years, he had lived in towers of glass and steel, shaking hands with the same faces, the same names, blind to those who moved around the edges of his empire. He thought of boardrooms where waiters vanished into the background, of conversations where women like Maya were invisible unless they carried a title that impressed him. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, the storm rattling the window behind him. "You're right," he said finally, his voice raw. "I've built walls so high I never saw anyone beyond them." Maya's gaze softened, but she didn't look away from the storm. Outside, the sea raged without mercy, but inside, something quieter cracked open between them. The ship rocked, thunder roared, yet in that trembling cabin, it was not fear that took hold. It was the beginning of truth. The storm broke sometime before dawn, leaving the ship swaying gently in its wake. By morning, the horizon stretched wide and golden, the sea burnished with light as if the night had never tried to swallow it whole. Passengers emerged cautiously from their cabins, their laughter tentative, relief stitched into their voices. On the upper deck, the world seemed scrubbed clean, salt and sunlight mingling in the air. Ethan stood near the railing, the collar of his shirt open, his gaze fixed on the line where sky met water. A group of investors spotted him, men in pressed linen and women in jewel-toned dresses, their conversation already circling around deals, stock prices, and market predictions. They waved him over, expecting the version of him they always knew, the strategist, the performer, the untouchable figure of power. For a moment, he almost moved toward them, the old reflex tugging at his heels. But then he saw her. Maya crossed the deck with her sketchpad tucked under her arm, barefoot, her linen dress still creased from a night without rest. The wind lifted the scarf from her braids, carrying it across her shoulder like a banner. She was out of place among the polished crowd, yet somehow more rooted, more real than all of them combined. Ethan felt the investors watching him, curious, perhaps already calculating what this moment meant. He did not flinch. "Maya," he said as she reached him, his voice steady, clear enough to carry. "I want you to meet some people." She hesitated, her eyes flickering toward the waiting cluster, but he turned with her at his side, not behind him. "This is Maya Jefferson," Ethan continued, his tone not one of apology or explanation, but of introduction. "She's an artist. She reminded me last night that success isn't measured in what you own, but in what you see." The silence that followed was sharp, unexpected. A ripple of gasps passed through the group, as though the simple act of naming her, of placing her beside him without excuse, was a breach of unspoken rules. For a CEO to acknowledge someone with no title, no wealth, no stake in their world, it was a quiet revolution, and they all knew it. Maya met their gazes calmly, the dawn light gilding her face. She did not shrink. Ethan felt the shift inside himself solidify, the walls he had once lived behind crumbling into the sea. And as the sun climbed higher, the deck no longer belonged to the investors or the empire he carried on his back. It belonged to the truth he had chosen to stand beside. The final morning arrived with the gentle hush of waves against the hull, the Aurora Odyssey gliding back toward port as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But for Ethan and Maya, the days at sea had redrawn the map of their lives. Passengers bustled with luggage and goodbyes, eager to return to schedules and obligations. But Maya lingered on the deck, sketchpad pressed to her chest, the salt air filling her lungs as if she could hold the ocean inside her forever. Ethan stood beside her, not as a CEO commanding presence, but as a man reluctant to let the horizon slip away. He handed her an envelope, simple and unmarked, yet heavy with intention. "A gallery in New York," he said, his voice quiet, meant only for her. "They need to see what I saw. This isn't charity, it's recognition." She opened it slowly, her fingers brushing the letter inside, her eyes widening not at the opportunity alone, but at the sincerity in his gaze. No strings, no ownership, only a door opened because her work demanded it. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe she belonged not just on the margins, but at the center. When the ship docked, they parted with a promise unspoken. He returned to his empire, greeted by assistants armed with calendars and endless calls. But something inside him had shifted. He no longer craved the next deal as proof of his worth. He carried with him the echo of Maya's laughter under the moon, the memory of her sketches alive with tides and tempests. His compass no longer pointed toward acquisition, but toward meaning. Months later, he stepped quietly into a gallery in Manhattan, unnoticed by the crowd gathered around glowing canvases. The walls were alive with her vision. Storms captured in furious strokes of indigo, dawn breaking in shards of gold, the restless sea rendered in a way that made the room itself breathe. People whispered her name with reverence. Strangers moved to silence by what they saw. Ethan remained in a quiet corner, content to let her brilliance command the space. When Maya finally found him, her eyes shone with the same fire he had seen that first night. No words were needed. In that moment, Ethan understood what had always been true. He had not stumbled into the wrong cabin on a ship. He had walked finally into the right life. If this story moved you, don't keep it to yourself. Someone out there is waiting to be reminded that their voice, their art, their truth can shift even the most unshakable walls. Comment below if you've ever surprised yourself, or someone else, by showing the world who you really are. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, give it a like, drop a comment, and share it with a friend. And don't forget to subscribe to Black Stories Untold for more stories that uncover hidden struggles, celebrate strength, and remind us that every voice matters.